was supposed to be an easy camping trip with a couple of friends, a chance to disconnect from our screens, escape into nature, and share some laughs around the fire. We picked a secluded spot about 2 miles off the main trail, far enough from civilization, but close enough that we felt like we could get out if we needed to, or so we thought. The first day was perfect, hiking through the woods, laughing as we stumbled on rocks and ducked under branches. We reached our spot by late afternoon and set up camp quickly. My friend Sam built a fire while Mark unpacked the food, and I set up the tent. It was peaceful, just us, the trees and the sky, slowly shifting to orange as the sun went down. That night we sat around the fire telling ghost stories, each one getting creepier as the shadows around us deepened. It was quiet except for the occasional crack of a twig or a rustle of leaves. But when it was Sam's turn, he said something that struck me as odd. "Did any of you see that guy back on the trail?" Mark and I shook our heads, confused. We hadn't seen anyone all day. Sam shrugged it off, saying he thought he saw a guy watching us as we hiked. But he laughed it off, and we did too, chalking it up to his imagination. Around midnight, we all crawled into our tents. I was exhausted, but I couldn't fall asleep right away. I could still hear the quiet hum of the forest, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Just as I was drifting off, there was a noise, a distinct crunch of footsteps outside our tent. I held my breath, convinced it was an animal. But then I heard another step, closer this time, followed by a soft rustling. I turned toward Sam, who was in his own tent next to mine, and whispered, "Sam, did you hear that?" His voice came back, barely audible. "Yeah, it's probably nothing, just an animal." But I wasn't so sure. Animals didn't usually linger like that, moving closer and then stopping. For a few minutes, everything was still, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it happened again, a soft, deliberate step, as if someone were trying to stay hidden. This time, the sound was accompanied by a soft, almost inaudible breathing. I felt the hairs on my neck rise, my heart pounding in my chest. I could tell Sam was awake too. I heard him shifting uncomfortably in his tent. Suddenly, Mark's voice broke the silence. "Okay, who's outside?" We all froze, waiting for a response, but none came. After a tense minute, I finally forced myself to unzip my tent and peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting an eerie orange glow over our campsite. No one was there. I whispered to Mark, "Probably just an animal." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. We all tried to go back to sleep, but I kept hearing every little sound, every shift of the wind. It was like the forest was alive, breathing around us. In the morning, we found something disturbing. Right outside our tents, there were footprints, boot prints that definitely hadn't been there the day before. They were deep, deliberate, like someone had been pacing around our camp. We stared at them in silence, a chill spreading through each of us. "Maybe it's another camper," Sam suggested, but his voice was hollow, like he didn't believe it himself. The rest of the day was tense. We decided to stay, but I noticed we were all quieter, keeping closer together. Every so often, I caught one of us glancing over our shoulders, as if expecting to see someone lurking in the trees, but there was never anyone there. That night, we built the fire bigger and tried to laugh, tried to bring back the lightheartedness from the day before, but it felt forced. We all stayed up as late as we could, huddled around the fire, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and one by one, we retreated into our tents. I don't know how long I was asleep before I heard the noise. This time it was louder. Footsteps, crunching leaves coming straight toward our camp. I froze, fear gripping me like a vice, as the steps drew closer and closer. I felt my pulse racing, my hands shaking as I lay there, paralyzed. And then, without warning, the zipper of Mark's tent started to open. I could hear him scrambling, his voice barely a whisper. "Who's there? Get away from me!" I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call out, to stop whoever, or whatever it was, but my voice caught in my throat. I heard Mark struggle, a muffled shout, and then nothing. Silence, heavy and suffocating. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed the flashlight beside me and turned it on, pointing it toward Mark's tent. The beam illuminated the inside, and for a split second I saw him. An old man, wild-eyed and grinning, crouched over Mark, holding a knife in his hand. I gasped, and the light caught his attention. He turned, his gaze locking onto mine, and in that moment, I knew he wasn't going to let any of us leave this forest. Without thinking, I scrambled out of my tent, shouting for Sam, who was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him along as we bolted into the trees. I could hear the man's footsteps behind us, steady and relentless. We ran blindly, our lungs burning, branches whipping against our faces. The forest was dark, disorienting, and every time I looked back, I caught a glimpse of him, stalking us through the trees, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. We ran for what felt like hours, until finally, we collapsed near a creek, gasping for breath. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew he was still out there, watching, waiting. We spent the rest of the night huddled by the creek, too afraid to move. When morning finally came, we made our way back to the campsite, our legs aching, our bodies covered in scratches. But when we got there, it was empty. No sign of Mark, no trace of the man, just the faint outline of boot prints in the dirt, leading away from the site. We reported everything to the authorities, but they didn't find anything. No signs of a struggle, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. To this day, I still don't know who he was or why he was out there, stalking us in the dark. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think I hear those footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, and I remember the look in his eyes.
The look of someone who found exactly what they were looking for.